Good morning and welcome to Sunday School at Second Baptist. I hope you're doing well and have had a good week. I think the weather has been a little bit more pleasant and not quite so hot, and it seems like we're moving towards having fall. Clint has been in New York City all week, and I'm supposed to go and pick him up from the train in Jessup on Sunday morning at 7:30. So by the time you see this, he should be back in Waycross, and he hopes to be at the 11 o'clock service on Sunday. He's had a good trip with our mission agency that we work with, and talking about reaching all sorts of people around the country who are not followers of the gospel. Turkish people and Iranians, Chinese, Africans of different tribes, and all sorts of other people. And so it's been a good week for him to meet with other people and make plans and strategies. So we're starting a new study this week, and that is the book of Colossians. Colossians follows right after Philippians that we just finished studying. And Colossians is another letter from Paul to the Colossians, or the church at Colossae. I guess that's the way you say it. And so, again, we get a personal letter written by Paul in which he shares teachings of the church and important truths about God and about Jesus. And you may remember that we've said these letters were, basically all the teachings that they had at the time. They did not have the written New Testament like we have it. The Gospels, were perhaps not even written down at the time that Paul wrote this, or maybe they were written and being circulated, but it was definitely not in a form like we have it. We're very fortunate to have all the teachings in one place. But Paul had studied and knew and was sharing then with the new churches the teachings of the gospel, and so that they would be on the right track with the things that they believed. And so let's get started then in the book of Colossians. Our lesson today is going to start with verse 9. So the first 8 verses, I'm not going to read them all, but I would like for you to read them as I did, and you'll see that Paul is greeting them like the beginning of a letter that you would do. And so greeting the members of the church at Colossae, and then also we learn within that Paul probably has not visited these people personally, because he mentions that they learned the gospel from someone called Epaphras. And so as Epaphras, and we don't know where he learned the gospel, but then he carried it and shared it to these people, and they believed, and they have formed a church. And so Paul, is saying from the very first day that we found out that you had followed the gospel, we've been praying for you, which is something that you would say in a letter. And so you can see that it's very personal again, even though he has not met them. And so let's pick up now at verse 9 and go forward. So verses 9 and 10. For this reason also, since the day we heard of it, we have not ceased to pray for you and to ask that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so that you will walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, to please him in all respects, bearing fruit in every good work, and increasing in the knowledge of God. So these are his hopes for the church. And of course, he re-emphasizes that they thank God for them and they've been praying for them. And he says, these are the things that they pray, or that they are asking in prayer, that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so that they'll be strong spiritually and know God's will for what they should be doing. That you'll walk in a manner worthy of the Lord. And we talked something about that in previous lessons, about walking in a manner worthy of the Lord and the Christian lifestyle, to please him in all respects, and bearing fruit in every good work. So, not only to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, but also to bear fruit. And bearing fruit could be acts of righteousness, or things that they might do to show their Christian faith, but also bearing fruit in the sense of bringing others to Jesus. And increasing in the knowledge of God. So I think a part of what Paul is going to do here then is to, say some things that are going to help them increase in their knowledge of God, of who God is. Let's go on then and read verses 11 and 12. Strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, for the attaining of all steadfastness and patience, joyously giving thanks to the Father, who has qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. So he's using some, church phrases there, I guess you might say. But he wants them, this is a part of a long sentence. Paul makes some very long sentences sometimes. So he's still talking about the things he prays for them. So he's also praying that they will be strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, for the attaining of all steadfastness and patience. And of course, steadfastness means, sticking to it, continuing with the gospel that they had followed, and being sure that it's a real thing and that they stick with it. And then patience, as they, anytime a person is a new believer, there are things in their life they have to lay down. And it takes patience. It takes some patience to lay those things down and to begin to live the Christian life. And then he says, joyously giving thanks to the Father, who has qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. And of course, the inheritance of the saints is, the eternal life that God brings to us as we follow him and as Jesus lives in our heart. And he was saying that, we are qualified to share in that inheritance. Both Paul and the Colossian church. Okay, now let's go on to verses 13 and 14. For he rescued us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. So here he's beginning now to talk about who Jesus is and the attributes of Jesus, of God, and how it all works together. So let's break down these two verses. It says he rescued us from the domain of darkness. And it reminded me of that verse that we hear sometimes where it says, where Jesus said, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. when we sometimes I have thought before I really paid attention to that verse, I was thinking more like the evil world prevailing against Christians. But that's not really what that verse says, is it? It says the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. So if you can visualize it that way, we as Christians enter the gates of hell according to God's will and bring out those who are in the darkness there. So the gates will not prevail against us, that we can go right in and bring people out, and the devil really can't do anything about it. And of course he tries, doesn't he? It's not an easy thing, and you think about going into the gates of hell, to get somebody. I mean, that wouldn't be a joyride, would it? And so he has rescued us from the domain of darkness, Paul says. So Paul, views himself and others, everyone, as living in the domain of darkness until he was rescued by Jesus and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. And so it's not enough to be brought out of the domain of darkness. That would be wonderful, but that's not enough, is it? If you've come out of darkness, you've got to be somewhere, and being transferred then into the kingdom of his beloved Son, of God's beloved Son. So he's talking about, you see in verse 12, he says, giving thanks to the Father, and that's who he's talking about when he says, he, the Father, rescued us and brought us into the kingdom of his beloved Son. So now, in this section, Paul is going to talk about God and Jesus, and the way that relationship works. Okay, now let's go on to verses 15 and 16. He is the image. Now he's talking about the Son, because he says he transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sin. He, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. Okay, now this is a very important concept. He says that, first of all, he refers to the incarnation. He says Jesus is the image of the invisible God. And we know that in other places in the Bible it says God is a spirit. And it says no man has seen him and things like that. So we have talked about the incarnation before, how Jesus came so that we could see and hear the things that God wanted us to know, because mankind just was not understanding everything. And so Jesus came in order for us to be able to have someone to look at and hear in a human form, to tell people this is the way that you relate to God. This is what God's intentions are, and many other things that he taught them. And so this first part then, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Now when he talks about firstborn, in the Bible, the firstborn child, the firstborn animal, or whatever, the firstborn is always special. And so what Paul is saying is that Jesus is the firstborn of all creation. In other words, he came before creation. He was born, if you can imagine it, before creation was born. And then it says in verse 16, "For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him." So he is declaring Jesus to be the creator of the of everything, dominions, powers, and all things. And so, we at that point, now we get back to the, trying to understand where God ends and Jesus begins, and we realize there's not an end or a beginning to that. It's altogether one thing, that God and Jesus are one. But Jesus was in the creation of the world he created. And everything that was created is through him and for him. Okay, and let's go on and talk about that a little more in verses 17 and 18. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is also head of the body, the church, and he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he himself will come to have first place in everything. Okay, so in verse 17, he's still talking about Jesus being before all things. He was in the beginning with God, as John says in chapter 1 of that gospel. And in him all things hold together. Now that is an important statement, and there was an interesting video that I saw some years ago. Some of you may have seen it, where a person, I can't even remember now who it was that did that video, but he was talking about how every atom in the universe is held together by an invisible force that's there, and he described it in much greater detail than I can do, and how if that invisible force was not there, if it were removed, the whole universe would just explode or expand into individual atoms immediately. And so he was talking in that video in making reference to this verse where Paul says, in him, in Jesus, all things hold together. So it's important, even if we don't think about that video and the atoms, to realize that the way that we live, our society, the things that happen on earth, whether by nature, hurricanes, volcanoes, or whatever, or the rise and fall of nations, or our daily lives, all of those things are held together by Jesus. He has control. He created all things, including dominions, rulers, and authorities. And then it goes on then. Now, so Paul is teaching. Now he's teaching to these new believers exactly who Jesus is and how he relates to God, how it all works. And hopefully they could understand it even better than we can, because they had firsthand knowledge. Paul was there to speak with the disciples, to hear all the things that Jesus may have said, because of course all the things Jesus said are not written down. There was so much. And so the teachings of the church came from the disciples. And, as Paul also had studied the scriptures extensively before he even became a believer, then he puts it all together. And so he says, now in verse 18, he talks about more attributes of Jesus. He is the head of the body, the church. And there are other scriptures, that describe that in more detail. But Jesus is the head of the church being the body of believers. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. So he came back to life and lives with God, sits at the right hand of the Father, it says in Scripture, to show us dominion even over death. So Jesus has complete dominion over creation all the way to the grave and beyond. That is kind of what Paul is saying. Okay, now let's continue to verses 19 and 20. He is also head of I'm reading the wrong verse. For it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, having made peace through the blood of his cross. Through him, I say, whether things on earth or things in heaven. Okay, so here in these two verses, Paul is talking about how God, it was God's pleasure to allow everything to hinge on Jesus, I guess you might say. And that through Jesus, all things are reconciled to the Father. So that gives us a picture of how we become a Christian. Because we can't just go straight to God and approach God. God is perfect. And there's no way that we could become perfect enough to just go straight to God. We have to have a mediator, and that is our Lord Jesus Christ, who mediates between us and the Father to cause us to be able to be Christians. And that is the most important thing that we have to learn before becoming a Christian, that we can't do it on our own, and that Jesus has to stand in that gap to make it possible, for us to reach heaven one day and to be Christians. And he also refers to everything being reconciled through Jesus. So, some of those things, have they all been reconciled up to now? Or are there future things to continue to be reconciled? There's a vague reference there, and we don't know all of those things. We would get into speculation if we tried to imagine what Paul was thinking on that part. All right, now let's read the last three verses, verse 21 to 23, and we're going to stop there because the next lesson begins in verse 24. So in verse 21, and although you were formerly alienated and hostile in mind, engaged in evil deeds, yet he has now reconciled you in his fleshly body through death, in order to present you before him holy and blameless and beyond reproach, if indeed you continue in the faith, firmly established and steadfast, and not moved away from the hope of the gospel that you have heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, was made a minister. Again, another long sentence. But he refers to the fact that the Colossians were formerly alienated and hostile in mind, engaged in evil deeds. And he doesn't spell those out here, but he has some knowledge, it seems, of how they were before they turned to Jesus, how they were before they became Christians. And then again, he talks about how Jesus has reconciled them to the Father to present you before him holy and blameless. So that is what Jesus does. You know, Jesus brings us to the Father and presents us and says, here is Harriet Bowman, holy and blameless, even though I know that I'm not either holy or blameless. You know, I have many sins. But Jesus then makes it right by his blood. And that is the picture of salvation, is how Jesus does that. And then, of course, Paul refers to the fact that if they, you know, continue in the faith and are firmly established in it, and not moving away from the hope of the gospel. So, you know, that I guess we might just throw in there, you know, that it's not enough to hear about Jesus or to hear about salvation. You must believe and follow, and Jesus must come into your heart. So it's a head knowledge of Jesus, and then it becomes a heart knowledge of Jesus when you really turn your heart over to Jesus. So it's not enough just to have that head knowledge. I mean, even the devil knows who Jesus is, right? But you must have that heart knowledge. Jesus must come. It's a spiritual connection when Jesus comes to live in our heart. So we'll leave it there for today. And we hope to hear the good news from Clint when he gets back from his journey. And I look forward to seeing you all on Sunday, if you can make it to church. And if not, then I know you'll be watching. And I appreciate you being a member of our class as we study together.